Welcome everybody to tonight's program. Jacob Hashimoto is best known for creating large-scale installations out of thousands of miniature kites, handcrafted of paper and wood. His works embody the tension between the delicacy and abstraction of the individual elements and the immersive graphic power of the large, sometimes enormous whole. Perhaps those of you from the New York area saw his cloud-like installations on Governor's Island in 2018. Rather than me trying to describe his work for him, it's now my great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Jacob Hashimoto.
Thanks, Robin. And thanks to all of you for having me. I'm flattered, and I hope that this is interesting for everybody. I'm always as well at a loss to describe what I do. But so I think we should probably just jump into some images, and I think that probably tells the best story. So I think at this point, I'm going to share my screen with you. So I start with this piece often. It was like the earliest of the kite works that I made that I've made. It started in 1995. It's called Perennial. And it's made of 365 of these little bamboo kites. This is funny because it's back in the days where we had to shoot 35mm slides. So the piece is actually about twice as long as this. And all these pieces hang from a wire in the ceiling, and they rest on the floor. And so when you walked in, it would make this kind of shuffling sound like leaves blowing by. Here's another image from here. And I had started building these kites in my studio as a student. I was a painting student at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. And like many students, I was having a lot of trouble kind of making work. And especially as I was getting to the end, there became this moment where, the pressures that I was putting on myself and kind of the pressures that we all continue to put on ourselves creatively, even as mature artists, became kind of, untenable, and I wasn't able to make any work. And I was talking to my dad one day, and he was like, you need to get a hobby in the studio. You need to do something like, build kites to go fly in the park or build model airplanes. And I thought about it. And when I was a kid, my dad used to build kites, and he would enter them in these little kite flying contests. And when he was writing his dissertation at the University of Idaho, he used to build these teeny little kites and fly them out the window of his office. And so I started building these little kites originally to fly in the park across the street. And as I built them, I started gathering more and more of them because I was learning how to do it. And at some point, I discovered that, I could make something out of them. And I made that first piece, Perennial. And then at the same time, I was working on this piece, which started in 1996 and was installed at the MCA in Chicago in 1998. And it's 10,000 pieces. And it makes this kind of giant sky canopy. And I called it the infinite expansive sky. And the premise of that was this idea of and I think we're all familiar with this notion of 10,000 bodhisattvas and painting 10,000 Buddhas, and how that is emblematic of the infinite wisdom of the Buddha. And so the kind of inside joke was, if you use old enough rules, you too can be God. And when you're 20 years old, it's pretty enticing. So, and this started as a small piece that I built in Chicago and Nathan Gallery. And Mark Francis from the MCA invited me to come and do what they call the Wall Project series. And I was 23 at the time. And I sat in there with him, and he was like, can you make it bigger? And I was like, the piece I had was 1,000 pieces. And we ended up building this, which was 10,000. And at the time, I was getting ready to go to graduate school. And so I built it in my parents' basement with a bunch of my high school friends. I've included here some other images. That last image came from a 4x5 color transparency. So you can see technology got a lot better by the time we redid this piece in 2008. In this here, we're going to look at this white piece again, but this was for my 20th anniversary, or what was it? It was my 10th anniversary show with the gallery that I worked with in Italy. And so we were kind of rebuilding some of the pieces that we had done together over the years. The white piece came later, you know, and an infinite expansive sky was an earlier piece. But I think you get a better sense of the movement. I'm probably you're gonna find that I'm hustling through images a little bit tonight because I've got kind of a lot of area to cover. You know, typically when I start showing this work, it's these big installations, you know, take some time to go over to kind of to explain the context of the work. In the case of, and then we go into the wall works and other things, but there's a lot to cover. So this is the white piece that we saw a chunk of. And this was originally built for Rice Gallery in Houston at Rice University. And they used to run a program that was super interesting where they invited artists to come and do a single project in their space. So it was like one giant sculpture, one giant whatever, one giant painting, one giant performance. And they funded it and they were super experimental. And then they called me up at one point. They were like, you know, we want you to do this giant installation. And I was kind of like, I don't really want to do that. I've done it a lot of times before with this other piece. And, you know, after discussing it with Kim Davenport, the director, you know, I kind of went home and I thought about it. And it kind of caused me to reflect a little bit on, you know, why I was interested in creating these landscapes, these huge kind of landscape-based abstractions, and these environments. And I started thinking about this cloud. You know, before it was like blue skies with these clouds on it. Now I'm starting thinking is like, well, how does this cloud, how does this kind of sculpture installation, how does it perform both as a sculpture? How does it perform as architecture? How does it perform as a stage? How does it relate to painting? How does it, you know, the history of painting that I come from? And which led me to kind of create these cloud shapes out of these ellipses. And we see this, I was very interested as a student in Japanese and Chinese ink painting and screen paint in particular from Japan, and how these painters use this cloud form to, you know, demarcate different, you know, if we're looking at a scroll, for example, demarcates different moments in history. You can have time change, you can have you know, you can travel long distances, you can have things happening simultaneously in two different areas. It's this device that is so, such beautiful kind of nuanced connective tissue to those pieces that I think I found it intriguing. I think that that's kind of where the work was going. So when we look at this, you know, screen from like 1676 by Shinobu, which is a screen from the Tale of Genji, you can see how they're using these clouds to kind of, you know, compress space, stretch space, you know, tell different parts of the narrative and have it broken up. And so as these artworks became kind of real world screens, and you see people walking through them and kids doing things on one side of the piece, and you can see them through these, this artwork, it created these kind of more complex narratives that I was kind of interested in. I was interested in the idea that also that, you know, the artwork became performative through the act of seeing. Let me see this again. This is Momoyama period piece. Butterflies, sorry, chapter 24 from the Tale of Genji. And this is a battle scene from the Edo period. You know, there's less of the fracturing, but I think the cloud element is really forceful and interesting, and we'll see it more in the later work. And so after Rice, I continued to kind of show this piece, and I made several different versions of it. And this is a piece that we did 2 years ago at the Crow Museum. I say we because I travel with a couple assistants that have worked with me for a long time. And you can start seeing how it's behaving, even the sculpture is starting to behave more diaphanously and kind of doing more of what's happening in those screen paintings. And the Crow Museum was really interesting because it allowed their gallery spaces had these permanent there's a permanent Tibetan structure back there that you can't move. So if you want to do an exhibition in the space, you really have to kind of deal with it formally. And I think it gave me an opportunity to kind of like really build a painting in that space out of these objects. These are 9-inch ellipses with rayon. Most of the pieces we've seen have been paper. The original Rice University piece was silk on bamboo. And so Robin had discussed this piece, and this was on Governor's Island. And thanks to Trinity Parish for loaning us this beautiful church out there. This piece is called The Eclipse, and it's got a screen print of a red, like it's a red American flag on black kites, which created this kind of saturated surface that kind of appears and disappears as you walk underneath it. In fact, lots of people don't even realize it's there. But it's this kind of giant towering cloud. This is an image from above. This actually is an image from above as we were working on it. So you can see what we were looking at. And it's about, each of these elements is made of paper. The string is cotton. And when we move this from place to place, because this is the third time we showed it. So we showed it first at Palazzo Flangini in Venice during the Biennale. And then we moved it to Dubai, where we showed it in a completely different configuration. And then moved it finally to St. Cornelius on Governor's Island. And every time we build the whole thing from scratch. So we take all the pieces in boxes, and we just have a bunch of rolls of grandma's best crochet thread. And we weave the whole thing together in this space, starting with putting down these cables that go across the entire building. And in this case, because St. Cornelius is landmark, we had to figure out systems to attach to the ceiling without putting any screws or anything into it. So usually at this point, I move the talk into this area where I discuss things like video games and algorithmic abstraction and contemporary landscape and world building and CGI and all this stuff that I typically talk about in terms of framing my work. But I think that given that this is a textile study group, I wanted to talk about some of the things I don't usually get a chance to talk about in terms of this work's relationship to textiles. And especially traditional, some traditional techniques. When I was in college, I used to go home in the summer and I worked for this really amazing artist, whose name is Keiko Hara. And she's a printmaker and a painter that's she's from Japan, but she lived across the park from my parents and taught at the same school that my father did in Walla Walla, Washington. And when I was a kid, I used to go and work summers for her in her studio, and she didn't pay me. She just made me work a lot. I learned a lot. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about what I learned with her. I spent 2 summers cutting katagami stencils. And I'm sure that you guys are, textile people, so a lot of you are aware of this, this particular technique. It's a technique by which you cut layered washi, which has been layered and laminated together with a fermented mulberry paste. And it's usually 3 or 5 layers deep, and it makes it thick, and it makes this kind of cardboard-like surface that then you cut patterns into. And so I spent summers cutting these for her. And then traditionally it's you take those patterns and you dab paste through the holes, which is a resist, and then you dye into the negative space of that. I'm going to start this by showing you a couple things, a few works by Keiko, just to give you some context about this person that you don't know. This is one of the prints I worked on, cutting out little flowers for her. And we were also carving stacks of wood blocks, so they're combination prints with chicolé and stencils. And she was doing large-scale installations too. And this This is called Topophilia quilt work from, I think this is from the late 80s. And it's hundreds and hundreds of woodblock prints and screen prints. And she built, and while I was working with her, we were working on some of these prints, which are these prints for the series of gates that she made. And I think you can see the affinity in my work for what she was doing. And you can also tell that this slide is from like 1987 or something like that, because it's 1984, because of all the little hairs on it. It must have been a 35 millimeter slide. So what we did was we printed all these woodblock prints and we turned them into shoji screens. And then built them into these gates. And she was at the time building 100 gates, and then she ended up building many more. This is the first show that she did at the Tacoma Art Museum, which I wasn't part of. I was kind of part of the second iteration of it. And you can see what some of the surfaces look like. And all of that is just hand-cut paper that we're pushing pigments through. So typically what she was doing was just a little bit different, where she was taking these lattices of paper and we were inking through them with pigment, which is not traditionally the way that technique's used, but she was doing it so that she could kind of complement this this monoprinting process that she was engaged in. And these are kind of samples. I think this is from the Edo period, or it's from the Meiji era. And it's a katagami screen, and you can see all of these images are cut out and then they're strung together with a lattice, so that things don't move around. And you just spend a lot of time cutting paper. This is another piece, just to give you an idea. And the other thing I learned working with Keiko was I learned a lot about paper and like what it could do and how I could stretch it and how I could bend it and how I could get it wet, and how, especially Japanese and Chinese and some Thai papers, the qualities of them, their inherent characteristics are different than anything that you would normally encounter. So I learned so much about the strength of the paper, how to manipulate it in ways that I probably wouldn't have had an opportunity to do anyplace else. And we see, this is where we see the white sections would be the stencil that remains, and everything else would be blocked out. And moving forward, also we see that traditionally this stuff was used for doing fabrics for kimono, and so there's also a whole tradition of kind of cloud designs in kimonos, which I was interested in. This is a contemporary pattern, but you can start seeing how the clouds are stacking. This is another one which is super blown out, but I think you get the idea. Which leads us into kind of the body of work that I was working on at the time that I was, that I ended up working on after this. And so this next group of work, really pieces that I selected so that we could see the relationship of this work to these kind of cloud forms as they moved onto the wall. So after doing, building these huge installations for years and years and years, I started making these wall works. I was kind of coming back to my painting and printmaking background. I'm gonna move through these pretty quickly, but I think that having seen the screens and kind of contextualizing them with also the cut paper, it makes sense. As we look at all of these small individual kite shapes, and the smallest of these kites are about 1.5 inches, so they get quite small at the surface. Everything you see is paper. There's no paint on it. It's just all hand-cut paper. So every dot, every squiggle, everything. These as well. At this point, we're starting to change a little bit, and I've introduced some digital paper cutting techniques. So we tend to run the studio, we either laser cut stuff, or we have it stamped out from dies, or we punch it with just punches from Michaels, or we use like a digital paper cutter to create these shapes. And oftentimes I'll do a key drawing that then will generate the patterns. And this piece is at, it's called As I Stood There on a Mountainside Where Time Is More Like Space, and this is from 2017. It's about, I think it's about 15 feet tall. It's massive, and it's in a building in Santa Monica. This is a detail, and you can see the surface of the paper and how, as it dries, it contracts. You'll start seeing these like white edges as the paper intersects other colors. This is called Passages and Voids Under the Razor-Thin Cosmic Labyrinth. And it's 2019. This was made for a collector from Finland. And each panel is 6.5 feet by 6.5 feet, so the whole composition is quite large. Again, all cut paper, even. And you can start to see like just the level of complexity when we get into those 1.5 inch pieces. And all of this we call freestyle collage around here is stuff that, you know, every single one of those is unique. It's like a unique little painting that builds this entire, you know, painting language. Let's see. So the base paper that we're using, most of the papers, and this is often a question that people ask, most of the papers are made in Japan. The base paper that we use is a rayon machine-made paper, and it's stretched onto the frames, the kite frames, using an acrylic polymer. So, and the particular acrylic that we use comes from Guerra Paint and Pigment here in New York City. We have used in the past Kramer Pigmente, but we have some problems with some of their products. Just not because they're not good, it's just because the particles in them don't penetrate our papers quite as well. So we found that Guerra really works the best. And so that's the white paper that you see. All the blacks and the colors these days are papers that are handmade for me by a small family mill in Japan. And because for years, and I think that as textile people, you probably appreciate this, textile dyes are really fugitive. You know, they're changeable. And so as you create an artwork, a tapestry or whatever, I remember going to the Victoria and Albert Museum in London and seeing this giant rug that they have there. I think it's like the biggest Chilean out there. And the light's on for, you know, a total of like 5 minutes a day. It's like in like fraction, you know, these increments that they'll turn this light on the piece because it's slowly changing. And it's changed so rapidly over the years that it's disappearing. And so when I was a young artist, I used a lot of, or a younger artist, I used a lot of papers kind of wherever I could find them, and discovered about a decade later that things were starting to fall apart and we were losing greens and blues, and different papers from different mills were changing all the time. And it got to a point where I was like, we can't use color anymore because this stuff's a nightmare. So I'm going to be like repairing artwork for the rest of my life, and it's going to get exponentially more dramatic. And so we stopped, and we're just doing like white on white pieces, and for about a year. And Hiromi from Hiromi Paper International in Los Angeles came to me, and we discussed the problem. And she brought a paper maker up, and she said, "This guy wants to make paper for you." And we worked with him, and we ended up building. We built this light box that had like all these UV lamps inside, and we called it the cooker. And we would put a control in a box, a black box, and we would cook these things 24 hours a day for like 3 months. And every week we would do an assessment of the papers. And finally, at some point, we were having a lot of trouble with greens. And I said to Hiroya, I was like, you know, these are the paper, I need you to replace this particular green color. And he went back to his shop and made us a green paper. It was dyed, and we tested it. It was terrible. It was worse than the papers we already had. And he sent us another one, and it was probably worse than the first one. And then he disappeared for like 6 months, and he came back, and he said, and with this paper that he called pigment-coated paper. And it's basically, he's figured out a way to print onto this handmade paper, essentially, and get kind of any color that we want. And when we put them in the cooker and we tested them, we were seeing really incremental changes over long periods of time and exposure, especially relative to basically all the dyed papers we'd ever seen. And so most of the color since that time, except for a handful of very, light buff colors and natural tones, all comes from Haroya. And there, it changed the nature of the pieces, but it also fixed this problem of light fastness. And it also opened the palette up to kind of a lot more vibrance, which we end up seeing in pieces like this, where you have these really grassy greens and these, these flower patterns, and you can see that the flower patterns are coming from like Illustrator vector files now, and that green pattern is coming from a drawing that we did. And then we're taking the drawings and digitizing them and using digital paper cutting techniques to create these surfaces. And this selection of work that we're going to see right now, there are so many pieces to choose from, but these were chosen kind of to build a little bit of a parallel construction between the kimono fabrics that I've been talking about and these kinds of traditional techniques and this kind of tradition of paper cutting and the kinds of graphic results that you get, because inherent to the process of creation, we kind of get this aesthetic that comes out of it. And then you can compound that by making things feel a little more kimono-like by your design decisions. But I have a lot of people that come to me and they talk to me about how Asian the work is and how, I'm fetishizing these techniques and practices. And I think that, some of it comes from the narrative of my life, but a lot of it comes from the fact that you can't do this with any other material. So, there's no European papers that I know of that can do what we're doing with these papers. So we inherently use, washi because of the way it's made, because it's, our colored papers are omnidirectional. So they tend to dry super flat. And if you've ever kind of gotten a piece of computer paper wet, you know that it curls up one direction. Or if you try to glue down a piece of magazine, you'll get this ripple effect in it. And that's because it's machine made and it's directional. And because these papers are handmade and the way that they come out on the decal, all the fibers interweave in multiple directions. They tend not to ripple at all when we get them wet. And they're also incredibly strong because the paper fibers are just enormous. I should be reading you titles. This is An Illusion Like Hope Itself from 2016. It's 53 inches by 48 by 8.25 inches. This is another piece. This one is called Staring into Some Infinite Distance, Not Unlike the Future, 2018. This was for a show in Stockholm. And the pattern actually comes from a photograph of the tarmac at the Dusseldorf airport out my window. And I had shot this picture of all the patches that they'd put in with tar, and we took it back and I cobbled it together into this pattern that we ended up cutting. And so the patterns come from tons of places, and we could spend a whole lot of time kind of dissecting each piece. So if you have questions about individual patterns, we can answer them. But I'm probably not talk too much about them individually. This one's called Perhaps No One in 5 Billion Years Will Come Upon Them. And that's from 2017. That's from a show in Helsinki. This is slow motion sequence in free loop space, soaring miles into the sky, 2017. And it's 66 by 60 by 8.5 inches deep. So everything's about 8.5 inches deep. And I should mention, I probably should have mentioned earlier that the way these things are constructed is there's a 2-inch piece of plexiglass on the top and the bottom. And into that are 8-inch dowels are buried. And they're 1/2-inch diameter hard maple dowels. And everything is suspended between these sets of dowels, like combs almost, and they're stretched really tight. So there's very little movement in them. I mean, they'll shudder if you put a fan on them, but they're typically very taut. And they're also built in a way that you can tension them a little bit after if they settle a little bit. I will mention that this pattern that we're looking at, the kind of cellular pattern, comes from like a microscopic view of bamboo cells. This piece is called This Dark Uncivil Forest, All a Twinkle with Madness. That's from earlier this year. This piece is called On a Pitch Black Lake It's from 2009. Usually I talk about this body of work in the context of solid and systems-based drawings, but I think it also works here in terms of like weaving things. And these pieces, there aren't very many of them, but they're incredibly dense and they're all woven together and knotted individually. And unlike some of the artworks, I feel like I could take apart and put back together. I'm not sure that's going to be possible with these. This one's called The Gorgon, 2019. This was made for a show in Italy, and you can see that you know, the paper again is using this repeating pattern, and we did that digitally and combined it more with handmade papers. And this is 54 by 48 by 8. Light like static vanished into shadows, 2018. 54 by 48 by 8.25. These are all machine cuts that we're doing, working with pixelation and pattern. This was made for a show at Site Santa Fe. This piece is huge, and it's called All of Our Tumbled Memories Momentarily Forgotten in the Numinous Celestial Garden, 2019. It's bamboo, paper acrylic, wood, Dacron. It's 10 feet tall and about 12 feet wide. And it's funny because when we moved into this studio that I'm sitting in now, there's actually a hole that we cut in the floor back there that allows us to extend from the wood shop, which is below me, all the way up into this space. So we had a 20-foot wall to work on. So half of us were on one floor and half of us were on the other when we were working on this. And there were a pair of them. They went to a building in Dallas, Texas. This is its complement. This is also 10 feet tall. On the Fate of All Stars, 2019. This piece is from 2017. It's called The Near Emptiness of Space, Perfect Timing in the Clutch of Gravity. It's 66 by 60 by 8.25. A lot of people ask me about the titles. And if I'd started at the beginning and read you all of them, there are a lot of really crazy titles. And part of the thing with titles, at least in my language, is that, you know, I'm looking for not the secret decoder ring for the work, but a second way for kind of people to engage in the process of seeing. So it's maybe something that's going to ask you a question. If you see something that's, you know, say incredibly beautiful and poetic and calming, and it has this incredibly violent title juxtaposed against it, I think it creates this kind of tension in the work, and the tension in the viewer that is desirable when we're, you know, asking people to spend more time with work. And because I tend to make things that, you know, err on the side of beauty sometimes, I think that oftentimes you don't get people to spend enough time with things to understand the hard things that you're doing, the more complicated things, the kind of weirder decisions that you're making. And I think that when you have these things that are, you know, titles like this one, The Warp of the Universe, She Reaches Forward Like Destiny, you know, you have some literal kind of, you know, issues with the galactic, but I think it also causes you to pause and think and try to decode it for yourself. And really, I think art lives when it challenges the viewer to kind of bring their own mind to the narrative, bring their own story. And that's also the reason that, you know, that I think that the kite for me is this incredibly good element to be working with, because it's this kind of democratizing element. It's an element that we see in like tons of different world cultures. You know, it's the Japanese or the Chinese or the Thai or the Indians don't have the corner on the market for this. You know, we have our own mythologies in the United States about, you know, kites and electricity. And I think that there's a sense of play and a sense of this kind of umbilical cord to the power of nature that I think is really evocative. And I think that as an entry point into the work, which, you know, we all know that contemporary art can be kind of intimidating or opaque. At its lowest common denominator, this is something that we all own and experience, and you know, it's ours culturally, no matter who you are. So I'm going to run through. That said, I'm going to run through some recent public works, because a lot of these pieces that we've seen, like especially the big installations, you know, we don't sell those. I don't want them to be in your house or anybody's house, because they're super fragile and they're messy and spiders will get in them. You know, they're just a nightmare. But we do get requests to do public artwork based on the artwork that, you know, I've done over the years. And so I put a handful of these pieces in here. This is a piece called "This Too Was a Chance Passage, an infinitely mutable house made of air, a gateway to the whispered possibility of existence," 2018. And this is actually in the headquarters of McDonald's, the hamburger people. And they came to me and asked me, they built a new building in Chicago with Skidmore, Owens and Merrill. And they came to us as they were building the building and asked me to build a sculpture for this set of staircases that run down the core of the building. And Jessica Stockholder did another piece in the building on the entrance level. And this piece is, what we've done here is made these out of resin. So, you know, the paper, because of lots of reasons, I think is too fragile for these environments, and because of the HVAC system, and because of kind of some boring practical realities of the fact that when you put a staircase in the middle of a building, it becomes a chimney. And this one in particular is a chimney because there's this giant ventilation fan at the top of it on the other side of the lights that's job is to, if there's any fire in the building, to suck all the air up through the building. So we had to engineer this so it was heavy enough that it wouldn't get sucked into that emergency system. And we built these panels out of urethane resin, which was a pain, and we could get involved in all the technical problems that we had with it. But it creates these kinds of heavier objects that are cleanable and much more durable. And what we've done is taken years and years of the collage work that we've done by hand. And one of my assistants is digitizing art, like years and years and years of this stuff. So we take pictures of what we call the racks down in the studio, which are where everything dries. And then we're turning all of those into vectors. And as we turn those into vectors, we're able to take those patterns that we've logged, this huge library of pattern, and print it onto rice paper. And we actually use a lab called Lamont in the city, which I'm sure you guys are familiar with, to print this stuff. So they've got a machine, it's a Swiss-made sign painting machine that prints on rice paper. And so we take that rice paper and then we float it in the resin. And so we can get a similar sort of energy to what we're getting with the handmade paper, but we have the durability of it being mostly plastic. And the string that we're using here, the string with all the pieces we've seen up till now has been a custom braided, like Dacron cord that Western Filament makes for us. And this fiber is Spectra, which is something that they used to make bulletproof vests out of. Its breaking strength is about 250 pounds. So it's incredibly tough. And Western Filament makes it for us as well. It's a little thicker, so we don't tend to want to use it for the wall pieces because I think it's optically, it's too much. And it drops all the way down. This piece is also in Chicago. It's at the Willis Towers, which I think most of us know as the Sears Towers, but since Sears is no longer with us. And they had there was a very famous Calder in this space for many, many, many years. And the Sears Corporation owned it, but it was still in the building when they ended up making some agreement with Willis, this development company, to take over the building. And there was some question as to who owned it, and especially after Sears went into Chapter 11, it became this whole kerfuffle. And now they had to remove it from the space, which is sad because I remember this sculpture really well from being a student there. But the nice thing is they came to me and they asked me to design a piece for the space. And so because Chicago is kind of where all this started, you know, and especially downtown Chicago, I wanted to make a piece that kind of harkened back to those old, you know, cloud-based sculptures that I was making early on. And so we built this. It's called "In the Heart of This Infinite Particle of Galactic Dust," and it's I forget how many thousand. I think it's 8,000 or 9,000 9-inch discs that have screen prints and UV printed. The Swiss sign painting machine is called a UV cured ink. That's the process. And so we have a percentage of those and a percentage of screen prints to kind of create a huge range of different stars. And it's like the slash of the Milky Way through this cloudscape. And you can see the shiny resin and how everything's put together. Again, these are 9 inches, so they're big. And these guys are super great to work with because they kind of redesigned the whole HVAC system and the lighting system to accommodate our sculpture, which is enormously heavy. They had to put in a whole second ceiling up there to support it. And these pieces are actually from this year. This is called The Sky, which is a very simple title. And it's at the Portland Airport in Portland, Oregon. And we've been working with PDX on, basically they're doing a terminal expansion, and they reached out to me to ask me to kind of involve myself in the competition. And, you know, I'm from, like I mentioned earlier, I'm from Walla Walla, Washington. And you know, for me, Portland was the big city, so I was super excited about the opportunity to go back and build some art for them. And unfortunately, everything with their building project, which is considered essential essential work, and our part of that didn't stop during COVID. So my team was flying back and forth like when almost nobody was flying, and making this happen and working under really, really difficult conditions. So this is one of two. They basically asked me to deal with two, what they call nodes in the airport. And the notion was that, you know, I wanted to create this piece, these two pieces. One is the city, which is this, and the other the sky. And the shape of each of these pieces seen from above is actually the shape of the city of Portland. And if you look at the pattern of waves through this piece and different iconography, it's actually a map of Portland itself, you know, including, you know, the Burnside Bridge and you know, all of the confluence of rivers that kind of shape the city. And these are those resin pieces, as I discussed earlier. In this case, we actually changed the material because they were concerned about maintenance with the spectral. And we're also concerned about, there's a lot of concerns when you work in an airport in terms of like, you know, fuel accretions and all of that stuff. And so they wanted something that we could take down and put back up. So these, we had custom made these fiberglass poles. There's, you know, they're up to 18 feet long. And we built specific hardware to clamp all of our elements on. And this is kind of what's going on in the studio. I think I'm at 43 minutes, and after my mistake at the beginning, I'm probably past that. But this is a glance of what's happening in the room behind me. We're preparing all these works for a show in Helsinki at Gallery Forsborn, which goes out at the end of the month. This is already in storage, actually. This one's called The Drift of Time's Fundamental Geography. And this is actually on the wall right over here. And I'm still working on it. You can see there's just lots of parts. And I thought I'd end by talking a little bit about this piece in particular. So all of these pieces have a lot more texture and a lot more layers in terms of where we're getting information and source material. And I think it might seem kind of arbitrary, especially when we blow through a lot of them, you know, where stuff's coming from. In this case, I just thought I would spend a couple minutes just describing some of that process. You know, when COVID started, I have a team of 10 people that work here in the studio. Everybody went home, and Derek, my assistant who lives across the street, and I were the only people left in this building. And so I was working with my designer, Brian, who's in Bushwick, and sending him drawings and talking to him about kind of what kind of patterns we were going to generate. And I started thinking about like, well, how can the source material that we're looking at reflect kind of my mood and like what everybody's thinking about, and not in a heavy-handed way, but in a way that suits the work. So we started thinking about like mortality and things that cause calamitous change in cultures. If we're talking about the bubonic plague or whatever, and this piece is kind of a mashup of two of those concerns. The top section is actually based on the cell pattern for Methuselah. Actually, I made this in the wrong order. And the bottom red pattern is from the potato blight that caused the Irish potato famine. And this is kind of this rudimentary image of the cellular pattern of the potato blight. And from that, we built these sorts of patterns and then cut them and built the pattern that we're seeing in the artwork. These are from the cell patterns of the bristlecone pine, which Methuselah is. And that's stacked on top of this other pattern. So it's kind of like Methuselah standing on the shoulders of the potato blight. And I think that all of us who are familiar with Methuselah, understand that it's like the oldest, tree on Earth, and it's in a secret location, and nobody, and it's this incredibly hopeful object in a certain sense, but it's also super fragile, and I think that I think it's really poignant. And so we built these patterns based on Methuselah's cell patterns. So we see this as the red paper, which we then turn into this. And that's all I got. That's what's on my wall.
Well, thank you. This was a great presentation, and you've answered a lot of my questions just in your presentation as well about materials and all. But we have a couple of questions, not too many. The first one was from Elise Caporel. Near the beginning, you were talking about a museum that your work was in, and she didn't quite get the name. She put down Curl. Do you remember something?
Yeah, it's the Crow Museum of Asian Art in Dallas, Texas, and I think we could even go back to that image. But they used to be called the Crow Collection, and it housed the Crow family's historical collection of ancient, Chinese and Japanese and Pacific Island art. And it's basically a permanent historical museum. And so the challenge, and the curatorial staff there was really interested in ways that they could bring artists in, especially contemporary artists, to kind of interact with their collection, to allow that collection to live in a different context. And I think that it's a real challenge because they also don't have traditional exhibition spaces because they are tasked with housing this permanent collection. So I think we're getting back to it.
Yeah, and I am going to, if people want to look at the Crow collection, it's crowcollection.org is the email for, the web address for the museum. Peter Sandiford wanted to know about the large wall works. Are they all assembled on site for each show, or?
Yeah, that's a good question. They used to be, and it's funny because my solution to putting them together kind of developed over a number of years, but now they just come straight off the wall into a crate and they ship as is. And it's funny because when you look at the mechanism that allows that to happen, it's incredibly simple, but it took me like a decade to figure it out. And then also to optimize kind of the thickness because everything's under tension.
Right.
So it's like, and you have to move it, and if it exceeds certain tolerances, it can crack or it can sag and do all sorts of crazy stuff. And so then there's also problems, with the really big wall pieces, they have to ride vertically. And so we end up getting like 18-wheelers out here and like having to ride them sideways and build specific jigs so that things are going.
There's
Because
a lot
if
of
they ride on their side, they'll tend to like slam into themselves as they
Yeah.
travel down the highway.
Yeah. Sandra Goldberg wanted to know about what is the frame around your white pieces?
The frame. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. And actually, that's a super good question, and I'm sorry I didn't talk more about it. So the frame is bamboo, and a lot of so early on, I used to build all the kites myself out of bamboo sticks, and you of course can get those, but when you start building circles, it's a real problem because you have to have like specific experience and like the specific equipment to do it. So all the round or elliptical kite frames actually come from China. And originally, I was working with a kite maker in Weihai and in Shandong province. Anyway, which is kind of the traditional, Shandong is the traditional center of Chinese kite making, and it's where the dragon kite comes from. And so when you start thinking about making a circular kite, the people that really know how to make a circular kite are from Shandong. Mm-hmm. And what they do is they superheat the wood and they bend it around these forms, and then they'll chop it up in a very specific angle, mm-hmm. and then flatten everything and tie it together, let it set and cool, and then tie the rest of the spars on. And it's interesting because we now make all of our kites in Guangzhou, all the circular ones. We still do all of the rectangles and hexagons here, mm-hmm. But all the circular or elliptical ones come from Guangzhou, and they've changed color because the people who sell bamboo in Shandong won't sell us the same bamboo in Guangzhou because apparently it's their bamboo. And I was Ai Weiwei and I show with a couple of the same galleries, and I noticed that he had done a series of silk kite pieces a number of years ago for the Bon Marché, I think originally in Paris. And I know exactly where those were made because he's using the bamboo that I want to be using. And and he really went to the best kite makers in the world.
Along the same lines with that, do you have like specific sizes that you go for, or do you kind of keep a stock in different sizes, or is each one a different custom for a particular piece?
We keep a stock of circles, and the circles are 8 inches, 6 inches, 5 inches, 4 inches, 3 inches, and 1.5 inches. Mm-hmm. And those are standard. And then we have things that deviate from that for specific projects. We'll make a whole, for example, we just did a piece in Turin, that was a very specific little installation in a home. And the pieces had to be very narrow and very short because we had very little room to move in the ceiling.
Yeah.
And so we made them specifically for that. But the reason that I think we ended up using the circle, which I always used to joke about, is like the lowest common denominator of abstraction. Mm-hmm. But is that I can turn it all these different directions. And so when I'm working on the wall, I'm not committed to one direction. And with the hexagons and the octagons, everything is very, very limiting in terms of the way you can use it. And so I think it's allowed a lot more flexibility in the language. I still do those other pieces, but I think that I get a lot more range in terms of imagery out of the circle.
Yeah. With the circles, we've had a couple of questions about how you kind of attach them. One, Benedict Canille wanted to know how you attach the circles together, and Marguerite Wolf wanted to know how the cut pieces are attached to each other, or is there hole punched, or are they tied?
Yeah, so hold on a second. So each piece is the paper is glued on the surface, and then what we do is we end up punching holes in the 4 corners and weaving a string through the surface. It creates a loop, and then that loop will get chained to another piece. And they're held at this V in the wood, which is this strength point. And so it's just a whole bunch of chains of these things going together. And then that's how we connect them, and we tie them off a loop on the top and the bottom. In terms of the paper and the adhesion, we use the same acrylic that we use for the initial adhesion of the paper, the base paper, as our glue. So all the way through, we're using the same adhesive. and it's mixed at about it's about 40% glue to water, and 40% glue, 60% water, and so it's very loose and almost like it's like a milk like consistency, and it allows the papers to get super saturated, and then they dry and they tighten up and they dry really nice and flat. There's all just layers and layers and layers of that, and some of these like what we call freestyle kites, have been worked on for. Have like 15 layers of paper on them. It's just crazy how thick they get because we just keep working on them until they get done. They're basically plastic when they're done.
Yeah. Chris Martins want to say that it was a really great presentation. Didn't catch how the original paper was attached to the circular bamboo, which you've just told us. And also, how do you produce the circular forms? We did that one. Joan Diamond wants to know, when you work with these different museums and airports and corporate spaces, how is your time managed? Do these places take a big hand in shaping what you should do, or are you fairly independent?
That's a super duper good question. It's a nightmare. I mean, working on public artwork is just a real hassle. And PDX, the Portland Airport, they were great, as great as they could be, but they have certain things, there's a lot of voices involved, and they have the citizens of the city to answer to, and so you're beholden to tons of people. And creatively, they were very easy to work with. They didn't really come back to me with a lot of different feedback, but the bureaucracy and the fact that you have to have like so much data for every screw that you put in there, all the fire data, you have to have burn reports and stuff. It's just like there's a lot of information and a lot of kind of project management that has to happen to make those pieces come together. And so we did the San Francisco airport, we did Willis, and we did PDX all in the last year or so. And when I got done with the San Francisco airport, I was like, I don't ever want to do this again. And I talked to a couple of friends, one of my friends who's an architect, and another one who's is Via Salmon's assistant. And we started a company. And the company is that Jameson runs installation and fabrication. Wade runs the architectural structural engineering component, getting all the permits, doing all that, making sure that we're up to code, interfacing with the architects, all the stuff I don't want to do. And my job is just to make the artwork. And PDX is the first project that we did that on. And I feel very, poor Jameson was flying back and forth the whole time because we were going to get sued if we didn't get it done because we were under contract to complete at a certain time on a large public work that was, with a lot of financial, components to it. We're doing a project right now for Stanford University's Graduate School of Education. They have been great, but there's also been a lot of, it's a fragile environment, and it's an environment in which people are very cautious in terms of the way they present artwork and what it means, how it represents the population. And so we've been engaged in kind of a long discussion about kind of what's going in this artwork, where the patterns are coming from. We're working a lot with some stakeholders in that community to kind of help craft, how that sculpture is going to speak to their students. And so you have to, and Wade and poor Jameson are doing that too. They're also doing a project in Namibia with the State Department because I did the GSA headquarters in Washington, D.C. a few years ago, and which was the worst experience in public art I've ever had. And well, I could do a whole talk on all the problems with the GSA and the art and architecture program down there, and kind of how we ran into the worst kind of case scenario of that. But it's I lose my thread. There's a lot of different ways these things go. Some are better, some are worse. In terms of the museums, there's a lot more flexibility. The exhibitions tend to be shorter. They don't have as much code to deal with really because it's a temporary exhibition space. So you have a lot more freedom. and they're really, they're there to let you do what you want to do. And so for the most part, by the time you actually get your foot in the door and you're in the process of putting together the exhibition, they just want it to be as spectacular as possible. If it means everybody stays up all day and all night for some weeks, it doesn't matter.
Yeah. We have two more questions, which I'm going to combine. They're from Radhika Tenenbaum and Tina Weinberger. In preparation for your large pieces, Radhika wants to know if you first play around at a smaller scale to experiment with the different patterns and things, and then how long does it take you to make one of these pieces? The question all of us artists hate.
Right. Yeah. In terms
and we all want to know.
Yeah. Right. It's like it takes a long time. Some of these pieces, like especially the museum-size installations, I've built over so many years, I don't know how long they take, honestly.
Right.
There's a piece called Gas Giant, which usually I show in the talk because it's one of the kind of cornerstones of my body of work.
Yeah.
And it is, this piece of the Crow collection is part of that. Wow. It's a fraction, but it's about 10 times bigger. The Gas Giant's about 50,000 elements, and they've been built since. And Infinite Expansive Sky, the first piece that we have, is folded into that, and several of the other large projects have just become this giant super sculpture. And so it's a piece that collects all the old installations. And then occasionally we show it. So we showed it one year at the Cunha Stampalia in Venice, and we showed it at MoCA's Pacific Design Center in Los Angeles. And when we did MoCA in LA, it was this 2-story building, and we did the entire building from the time you walk in the door all the way through the first floor, up the staircase into this room that's like got 15-foot ceilings that opens into a vault that goes up 36 feet. And we filled the entire thing. And it took a month for us to install it with, if memory serves, about 16 people working on it every day. And like 4 scissor lifts. I think there's a video online someplace of us together.
And do you play around with smaller pieces?
Oh, yeah. No, I don't. Everybody thinks it's so reckless, but I show up with a bunch of boxes of stuff, even with the MoCA show. I have an inkling of what I want, but typically it's like, you start in the corner and then you just move radially outwards from that and adjust as you go. It's a little, at this point, it's like being a good watercolor painter, because you know what certain decisions mean,
right?
And what you can fix and what you can't fix. Early on, it used to. I remember there was one instance where I was showing in Los Angeles, and we installed most of a piece, and it was, maybe 800 pieces. And I came in, and I was just like, we have to cut it down and start over. And one of my assistants left. They're so angry. They're like, I can't believe it. Because I had made some mistakes I couldn't defeat without cutting all the way into it. Unfortunately, I think I was like 27 years old, so I was like, let's just do it.
Right. Oh, well, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation and for taking all of our questions tonight, Jay.
Well, thanks for having me, you guys. And again, I'm sorry, but I don't know what happened with everything was so smooth, Debbie, when we did our technical.
I know, that's the way it works. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you, everybody, for joining us. And, I have 1 or 2 more questions. Just, do you create work for private customers? And someone else said, thank you, this was delightful.
Oh, that's nice. Yes, we do private commissions for Duo. We just finished one today. It depends. There are years that I remember, driving around and doing all these things by myself and going to meeting with people, and then I would have to stay in their houses for a long time. It was just me and a lanyard and all a string, and I had some, and that was fine. I was a young kid and I didn't have anything else to do. I had a Ford Econoline minivan with a bike in the back, and I would just drive in and ride my bike around. And but there came a point when I was just like, I'll do commission work with you, but you have to be really cool. You just have to be somebody that we get along with. Because especially like we're doing a piece right now for a house in the village. And the guy who's buying it, he's got some crazy energy, but, I had to go meet him first, and just figure out if we were going to be able to get through this, because it's really a leap of faith on everybody, and everybody's part. And, we do renderings for those things. So there's a lot of digital rendering. Like when you're doing a piece like PDX, you have to have a digital rendering. So that component's involved, but, there's a gap between what we can do digitally and what's actually going to show up. And so all of that is this kind of working with people that understand kind of the nature and the kind of mutability of what you do is super important to kind of like keep your stress levels as low as possible. Mm-hmm. So the answer is yes, but not with everybody.
Okay, well, thanks again, Jacob, and thanks to everybody. And that's a wrap. Have a good evening.